Hey everybody, how you doing? It's Marc Ross. It's October 27th, Ructions podcast. I'm Marc Ross. With me always, my good friend, Gerald Ashley. Gerald, how are you?
I'm well. We're heading towards November, and we changed the clocks this weekend in the UK and Europe. I got a feeling you guys wait a week. I think you might be a week's difference, but we get an hour extra in bed in return for it being dark at 5 o'clock in the afternoon or whatever it will be. And then we've got this sort of miserable period, I think, from then until the shortest day. So there we are, nice and cheerful. 6 weeks of things getting dull and gloomy, and then I don't know why. I don't think it affects me mentally or health-wise, really, but just feels more positive once we've got through the shortest day. So there we are.
Yeah, there's no doubt it's not affecting you mentally. Your mental health
there's
is...
this thing called SAD or something. I forget what it's.
Yeah, seasonal affection disorder. What's the A stand for? Yeah.
Lack of sunshine and whatever. So there we are.
Yeah. Well, none of us have that. Well, maybe we do, but we're not talking. We're not man enough to talk about it. Anyways, something we are man enough to talk about: disinformation. I learned this new term, Fauxtography. Have you heard this term, Joe? Fauxtography, where there's so many tools now around AI. You can create the perfect photo. You can eliminate background, et cetera, et cetera. It seems like we've been, as humans, been manipulating information and photos for a long time. But disinformation front and center. A lot of hotshot news organizations trying to sort it out, keep us smart, keep us informed. BBC Verify. What is this all about?
Well, I think there's a lot of threads you've laid out for us to sort of pick through here straight away. I think a lot of this, if you look at the really big strategic picture of broadcast media and print media, is the business model has so changed that the way that we consume news or take note of news is not at all helpful for the big boys. In many ways, they've been disintermediated by technology. And so this has got its plus side where, sometimes you get real live reporting for a little film clip from somebody's phone, and that can go into the news straight away. But of course, why bother to send it to the news? Why not just stick it on your Facebook page, stick it on Twitter, shock horror, start a podcast. And you've got a situation now where, to me, the whole news arena is completely atomized. And I think the big boys got a real problem because their funding model of advertising has been upended as well. You and I are both of an age who can remember the old classified ads in newspapers, which was a kind of large part of what their revenue came from.
Actually, surprisingly ginormous part of their revenue. I mean, when that got shifted away, unbelievable loss of revenue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's been a slight, well, not slight. I mean, there's been an important race to the bottom, because everybody's trying to grab everybody's attention, and everybody's attention span has got shorter and shorter. And it's very difficult if you're a big news provider, New York Times, Washington Post, Sky Television, whoever it may be, BBC. How do you compete with all of this stuff without becoming a little bit raucous and, that famous phrase now, clickbait? Now, one of the responses has been, and particularly by the BBC, is to try and say, well, what we're going to try and do is we're going to watermark stuff. We're going to kind of put our seal of approval on stuff. And we started to see this in the UK. I don't know when it happened in the US. We started to see this around 2015, 2016 of funny enough, the Brexit campaign, and maybe even the Scottish independence campaign before that, where the major broadcasters started employing so-called fact checkers that they were going to check all the claims and counterclaims by various politicians, pundits, all the rest of it. The problem is a lot of those guys sort of slipped up themselves, because in this atomized world now, as a fact checker, you get it slightly wrong. People carpet bomb you on Twitter and all the rest of it. So it just sort of fed into this machine. Now, the BBC have now come up with something called BBC Verify. And I think this is a mistake. If you think about it, the BBC it's 101 years old, I believe, this year. For at least 90 of those years has been a sort of gold standard of you can kind of believe the BBC News. I have to say that I think that has been degraded over the last few years. There's been some doubts about it. And BBC Verify, in a funny sort of way, actually, I think makes things worse. Because do I now only believe things on the BBC, or only the things that BBC Verify have said? So they've slightly split their brand. And this is more your field than mine, but it reminds me a little bit of the introduction of the new Coca-Cola formula, which, this is new Coke. It's so good, it's better than the old one. And of course, they had to pull it pretty quickly because it was going to fall between two stools. I understand why the big media organizations are trying to get a grip on all of this, but I wonder if it's kind of too late. I mean, a joking comment I saw the other day was that we used to watch mainstream media to check out the nonsense on social media. Now people look at social media to fact check mainstream media. So the whole thing's upended. And I'm not too certain where it ends, but I think trying to set yourself up as judge and jury with a sort of verify system is not the way forward.
Yeah, I have a few things to say. We're going to talk about AI regulation a little bit too. And the big buzzword in town is this idea, you brought up, kind of watermarking. Like, is this image, if it's AI generated, it has to have some kind of watermark to tell you that it's not real or it's artificially generated, right? So this idea is interesting that it's percolating, obviously, within elite circles in DC, London, Brussels, etc. How do you verify information? I think two things. Like, obviously, Trump was he still is like such an apex predator, or he's shameless. He doesn't care. He'll say whatever. That nobody had ever dealt with him before, especially in the newsrooms, and they didn't really know how to deal with it. And obviously, there's always been misinformed, crazy, wacky ideas, but they've never reached this level. Obviously, when the Gutenberg press came out, all kinds of people had tons of problems with that, et cetera. So, the human behavior around disinformation has been there for a long time. I think the challenge with newsrooms is that they do know what's going on. Like, they get the news, they know what's happening, and they're trying to find a way to say this is accurate, right? But how do you do that? I think you're exactly right. Like, is BBC verified better than BBC? Yeah, it's this really bizarre situation. And then, as we were talking about on Twitter, like with the hospital that was, bombed by who knows who, right? It was initially suggested by Israel. Yeah. It looks like it was probably by Hamas. It was an accidental bombing. But there's also an instinct within newsrooms where there was like a bias that they felt like this was going to happen. So when it did happen, quote unquote, they jumped to the conclusion, they filled in the blank. So even the most educated of us have the most information, have our own biases, and I think that's like the big challenge, whether it's verified or not, the way we see the world, culture, etc. It's a really interesting challenge.
If my Latin was better, I'd remember the quote, but in English, it's who audits the auditors. No doubt a viewer or listener will slide something my way to explain what that is in Latin, but it's a very famous quote, and it is who's guarding the guards, if you like. And so who is, where is the top end of all this chain of so-called truth? And of course, you can't do it. But I think to set yourself up to try and do it, I think you risk riding for a fall. And very unfortunately, I mean, one of the junior journalists, or relatively junior journalists, who's been put onto BBC Verify as a sort of, front on screen talking head, turns out that she had a couple of, let's call them inconsistencies in her CV or resume. And that was leapt upon instantly by the social media crowd. And I think this is a problem. If you set yourself up to be judge and jury, it's very difficult. To your point about the situation in the Middle East, I think actually some of the reporting has damaged the BBC quite badly. And we forget what a large organization they are. So they have a large amount of foreign language radio stations, and they have a whole big section called BBC Arabic. Now, there's been some suggestion that some of the reporters there have certainly been very biased, and it may have slid through because, okay, it's been done in Arabic, it should still be monitored, but it's clearly not monitored in quite the same way. And so I don't know what the answer to all of this is, to be honest, but I think it means that maybe we lived in a slightly unreal golden age where, rightly or wrongly, people in the States would gather around and listen to Walter Cronkite every evening, and you got this sort of magisterial summary, and you believed it to be true. And okay, maybe frayed at the edges as long ago as the Vietnam War, people started to say, well, is this the full news that we're getting? But now the access to so much news and information, I think, makes everybody incredibly skeptical of the large media organizations.
Well, there's state actors, and you're right. Where you grew up, how you see the world, is very indicative of how you're going to report on the world. And sovereign states, China, Qatar, Bahrain, they all have a vested interest. I mean, why should they just leave it to CNN and BBC to tell the news of the world? So that's also an interesting dynamic. I also think I've spent so much time around reporters. There's just I feel like internally they're wrestling with this. We have the right information. Like, we know what we're talking about. Like, they don't know how to channel almost their frustration without adding these labels, if you will. There's this is verified, this is accurate, we're giving you the real news. Even today, I was listening to Bloomberg Radio, and their big tagline now is news with context, right? Because the context will give you better news, right? If you understand how this news is being gathered, somehow that'll give you better information. I don't know. It's a very dynamic, interesting time, and I think it's not going to get any simpler. I also think about Food Network, and you must have an equivalent station in the UK. The Food Network's been around for 30 years.
Right.
It's dedicated to cooking, right? I always think about this. It started out with high-end French chefs like Jacques Chapin and Julia Child, classic French cooking. Now, 30 years later, it's competition shows. It's Guy Fieri, eating cheeseburgers in Ohio. And, as you go mass, you're going to get less sophisticated, if you will. I'm trying to say that politely.
It's part of this race to the bottom, because
right.
The business model now is about click on my show because I'm much more outrageous than the other guy. And,
exactly.
Lord knows where that ends. We will still be an island of sensibility and sense here, I'm sure.
Did you say we'll be on an island? Is that what you meant? Like Alba?
No. I mean, an island of...
We'll be sent to an island.
Yeah, no, we're an island of sense in all this maelstrom of nonsense around
an
us.
An island in exile. I think that's what you meant to say. Anyways, I think it's an interesting space to watch. What's interesting for me as a communication person, I don't really, I tell my clients or even myself, it doesn't really matter what I think or what I want or, sometimes you just got to be, I'm sure there's a great Latin phrase for this too. I mean, this is the way it is. This is the world we live in. This is the reality. You can't, stop it. You got to figure out how to ride this wave, so to speak. There's no way to deal with disinformation. I mean, it's just information. At the end of the day, there's, what you see or what you believe, perception is reality, all these cliches. That's going to be the interesting challenge for kind of global companies and global executives.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And as I say, maybe we had that sort of golden age of stability, or maybe we were less demanding as viewers and readers of news. And that has just been blown to bits as far as I can see. I don't see it will come back.
100% will come back. In fact, it's only become more. As you think about, as we're talking about AI and machine learning, I mean, eventually, why would I even get my news from DC? Like, I'm sure there's somebody in Norway that's going to do even a better job. It can be translated in English,
Well,
etc. I mean, that's also an interesting situation.
on a basis, things politically often seem to happen first in the States, certainly in terms of elections. So we go back to the famous Kennedy-Nixon debates, radio and TV. Coming up next year, you've got the first election that may be AI influenced, I suppose.
Yeah.
Lord knows what that will mean.
It'll mean better democracy.
You're always an optimist, Mark. You're always an optimist.
Let's get to kind of the big issues. Obviously, this week, it appears the Gaza invasion might be on hold, but last night the United States took out some, what do I want to say, proxy militant bases in Syria, which is quite interesting. More and more material going to the Middle East. Macron, Sunak, Schultz, they've all been there. Even Albanese, who's the Australian Prime Minister, was asked if he's going to make a trip. Obviously, more and more people, more material. Ukraine seems to be obviously still a conflict that's still happening. And then last night in China, the former premier had a heart attack. And while this is happening, the Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi, is in town in D.C. right now, setting up a potential meeting between Biden and Xi in November. Wow, a lot. The world is getting really real.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's probably true to say that there's always a lot going on, but I think 2 or 3 points to pick out of that. And we always put the spoiler of saying, how on earth can anybody understand what's going on in the Middle East? But I think the one thing that hasn't happened yet and would be an alarming development if Hezbollah in the Lebanon get heavily involved, because then I think that, people are already saying, oh, well, this is rattling markets and the oil price is going to go up and this, that, and the other. But it will take on a different dimension if it was a similar situation in northern Israel and Lebanon. That's the one point. The second point, maybe, I wouldn't say it's obvious, but it's increasingly the case that the Ukrainian war is bogged down. And, the summer offensive hasn't really gone anywhere. We get a lot of news reports that this village or that village has either been taken or retaken or taken again for a third time. And, this is exactly the same if we were reporting from the Western Front in 1915 or 1916. In fact, I think the advances in the First World War were larger than the ones that have been in Ukraine. And it's a low technology. I was going to say it's a low technology war. That's not true, but it's a bizarre technology war in the sense that there's a lot of low tech drones and a lot of amazingly high tech stuff. And it seems that if you're in the middle, you're in the wrong place. And maybe terribly cynical, but I think it's going to change a lot of people's views about defense and defense spending and all the rest of it. And then your point about China, will we ever really understand what's going on in China? Will people really ever understand the dynamics of what goes on in Communist Party high-level meetings? But they have a track record of people dropping out of the scene. Now, it's quite probable that a gentleman had a heart attack and died. It's not unheard of to happen, but it just kind of feeds into the sort of mystery of, oh, he'd been dropped by Chairman Xi because he was seen as too much of a reformer, and Xi wanted to go more the sort of state control route. And look, hey, now he's suddenly died. That may be adding 2 + 2 and coming up with about 7, but it just adds into the sort of, maybe not the impotence, but the concern in the West that they don't necessarily understand the dynamics of what's going on in China.
I think, I think I talk about this all the time. Like, factions to me are like the most interesting thing. James Madison, Federalist 10, any kind of system, whether it be the Catholic Church in the Vatican, whether it be Westminster, whether it be the Chinese Communist Party, there are factions that work. What's interesting again is I think about this like back in, I guess it was in June or May, like Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was due to fly to China, but this crazy spy balloon comes over, right?
Oh yeah.
That trip gets canceled. And then, right, this gentleman passes away while the new Chinese foreign minister is in town to set up potentially a meeting. The coincidences are just, it's so bizarre. And I feel like China's just rife with factions. Like, even like we have red states and blue states, the dynamic in China between Beijing and Shanghai and et cetera, and reformers and people that want state control. I don't know. I mean, the challenge I think with China is that, well, where there's smoke, there's fire. It's so bizarre the way these coincidences happen that it just lends yourself to start thinking, what the hell's going on?
Yeah, and one that sort of briefly appeared in the headlines and then slipped away quite quickly is this slightly bizarre incident of the Chinese ship that seems to have cut a couple of cables and dragging
an anchor over important pipes
around, which is kind of interesting. And again, what do we make of this? And also, maybe certainly in the UK, maybe being slightly frivolous, but certainly in the UK, there's quite a genre for sort of cold case TV programs, going back looking at cases that have gone cold. Well, in geopolitics, there's a lot of cold cases out there. Nobody's really got to the bottom of what happened to the gas pipeline last year. I mean, that's, we've all forgotten about that, but somebody blew it up. And, a lot of finger pointing as to who it may be. And I wonder if this will be the same with this thing in the Baltic.
Yeah, that pipe is super interesting. Like, why that isn't getting more attention? Even, the Nord Stream pipeline. And then what's interesting, like preceding this, the attack last night by, the U.S. Air Force, U.S. military against these bases in Syria. I mean, there were drone attacks on these bases in Iraq, and up to 24 Americans have been, some kind of injury. Which all they've said is they have brain injuries, right? So concussions, but that's bizarre, like 24. And then, getting back to the news story, it's also interesting what leaps out or what becomes news. Or the government still, to me, whether it's verified or not, still has a tremendous amount of control over what becomes news and what is encouraged, if you will, to be covered by our glorious news organizations.
I think if we were to make a prediction, well, no, I wouldn't say make a prediction, but one that I always feel doesn't get very much coverage is the vulnerability of the world's transocean communication lines. I mean, there was a big hubbub about a year ago about so-called Russian trawlers in around Iceland. Was, the British were worried that they were snooping around looking for some of these sort of transatlantic cabling and all the rest of it. And we live in a world of ever more sophisticated satellites and all the rest of it, but there's still a lot of backbone infrastructure that is just big lumps of copper wire or maybe glass fiber, some of it, girdling the world. And there's a big risk there. So there's plenty to worry about, as usual.
Getting back to Ukraine, I think what's interesting is, I don't know, is Putin even becoming bored with Ukraine? Because, there's reports that there's a delegation from Hamas that somehow got to Moscow to meet with Putin. And then there was a story in the FT. I just saw that basically the gist of the story was about 800,000. They suspect 800,000 to a million Russians have left because they didn't want to be associated or they're afraid of the war. But more and more of them are moving back because is it a standstill situation, or is this like Russia is coming back into the fold? Is Russia even getting bored with the war? Interesting times in Moscow as well.
And I think from a Ukrainian point of view, all of this is, this attention in the Middle East is deeply unhelpful because they've run, if nothing else, they have run a superb news management and PR operation, really, and up against a lot of disinformation from the Russians. But now I just wonder if Ukraine is kind of slipping off the headlines and, will it be so easy come the other side of the winter to raise more money for more armaments? I mean, there are some talk that already they're short of some armaments just from the sheer scale of what's going on. And that's the other thing that's quite interesting for what is actually quite a major war in a way. It's regional, but it's a major war. We get these sort of snippets of drones hitting tanks and things, but we don't get many people on the ground doing very wide reporting of what's going on. And maybe it's because it's so stuck and there's nothing going on. But I think it's dropping out of people's minds, and that must worry the Ukrainians, I would have thought.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It'll be interesting to see Zelensky, I imagine, will have some kind of PR campaign in the coming weeks. I want to ask you, I mean, you're an expert in this space, human behavior, history, economics, things that have happened. I myself know, I guess I know a lot about conflicts after or during, if you will. Like I think about, my knowledge of World War II is really about the conflict itself and how it was settled. But the run up, people are like, what is happening? I mean, there's stuff going on in Africa, obviously the Philippines, Taiwan, China, Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Hamas, Iran. I mean, there's a lot of voices, there's a lot of material moving around.
Well, is
this a run up to something bigger, or is that just me freaking out or, trying to make a connection?
I think a lot of it is the fact that there's an availability bias. This stuff, 30 years ago just wasn't available. We didn't see all this news gathering. We didn't see all this instantaneous analysis about places people have no idea where they are. The usual sort of fun interviews. You stop people in the street and ask them, what is the capital of Nigeria, or where is Morocco, and you get some kind of quite eccentric answers. And I'm not suggesting I would know all the answers, far from it. But we are soaked in a lot of all of this stuff now, but I think people at the general public level they just kind of ignore it. I mean, there's quite a prominent BBC journalist, Nick Robinson, a radio journalist, complaining that BBC radio news and current affairs, their listenership is dropping quite considerably, and he said, "Oh, it's people are kind of fed up with news. It's not our fault. It's the fact that people just don't want all this news." And there may be some truth. There may be some truth in that. Actually.
But do you check yourself, or how do you regulate? It's interesting. Yeah, is it really an availability bias, an assumption bias? I mean, do you yourself, as a news reader, historian, somebody who looks out for risk?
I tell you what,
how do you say oh, this is risky, this is something I really should be concerned about?
I tell you what I think is missing, and maybe that's part of our great ambition why we have these little chats every couple of weeks, is that I think there's a place for slow news. There's too much fast news, too much breaking news, too much, and now we've got this live picture, which isn't very good, but it's live of some incident, and does it really matter in the scheme of things? And you would have thought somewhere in the media space there should be room for the long print media. Maybe it's political magazines of all biases and shapes, and maybe that specialist podcasts or even more general podcasts will become more important in the future if people just slow down. I think one of the problems with history is when you read a history, the result. So we know who won World War II. So when you read all about May 1940, where the British government is all over the place, France has fallen, it wasn't at all clear what the right thing to do was. But people say, oh, well, it was very obvious, they had to go for Churchill and they had to do this, that, and the other. It was not at all obvious at the time. And this is a problem with guys like you and I, because down in the saloon bar, you and I can solve everything. And actually, when you actually have to do something, it is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult. I mean, if you're president of the United States, or you're in the sort of inner circle of decision makers in the United States, you've got a huge menu of things to try and decide upon. and how do you rank them? And that's incredibly difficult and slightly worrying is this move in politics towards trivia, because it's easier to deal with trivia. Your famous example of theatre tickets that we now mention at nearly every episode of the States. And I've got a new one for you. Of all the things that are going on in Europe, whether it's immigration, whether it's the recession in Germany, whether it's a lot of indebtedness in Europe, what is the European Union talking about today? They're talking about whether or not they should ban Coca-Cola bottles. Now, this is going to be a massive storm in the United States. I imagine people will be moving straight away back to freedom fries and all the rest of it. But
the iconic Coca-Cola bottle.
But there's a pattern here, isn't there? That sometimes, and we do this personally, don't we? If you're faced with something that's really difficult to deal with, well, deal with something that's a little bit easier. At least you feel you've achieved something, even if it doesn't really count for much.
Yeah, there's a bias, within governments to, do something, to govern. I'm interested in the bottle stuff. That's interesting. Actually, great. I don't know if you know the story, but the brief on that essentially was, the owner of Coca-Cola was like, I want a distinctive bottle that you could grab in the dark and know that it's Coca-Cola. And it has like this iconic shape, and
it's phenomenal, isn't it? It's an absolute.
It's really amazing.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's a work of art. I mean, it's like really a staggering piece of art. You think about it.
Not to be seen on the streets of Paris soon, maybe. Who knows?
Paris. Oh my gosh. Anyways, let's speak about. Well, I don't have a good transition from Paris to AI, artificial intelligence. Next week, AI Safety Summit. Rishi Sunak is calling. Bletchley Park. Right, pretty interesting. And also the White House is expected to drop an executive order. And if you're not familiar with an executive order, essentially it's administrative law would be the best way to describe it. It's not something, a law has to be passed by Congress, signed by the president, but an executive order basically tells the agencies what to do. It's this weird kind of black box administrative law. It does have weight, but it's not a law per se, but it's administrative law, if that makes sense. Also, the White House is supposed to drop something. What's interesting is that, as we were talking about before we went on the pod, when I was reading here, like Sunak is saying, quote, humanity could lose control of AI completely. That sounds terrifying. They've gone dystopian right away, terrifying. And then the White House is really focused, obviously, on national security. I don't know. Obviously, the end of the internet not being regulated is over. More regulation is coming. Probably needed, but it's just so scary. What is happening?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would do is direct listeners and viewers to a professor of complexity at Santa Fe Institute in the States, and she's called Melanie Mitchell, and she is the go-to academic who can talk in normal, plain English about what is AI and what isn't. And taking her lead, I'm a little bit skeptical about how much of so-called AI is AI and is not just machine learning. Now, that's not to say it's not hellishly clever. I mean, it is hellishly clever, but it's also stunningly stupid, because all it actually does is takes digitized past data and jumbles it up and juggles it and makes use of it in a new manner, which is why it can do fantastic things with graphics and photography and filming or video of things. But at the end of the day, it's not creative. So, okay, that's maybe just an argument about what's AI and isn't AI. Let's just use the term machine learning. Machine learning is upending things, and it's going to disintermediate a load of people in white collar jobs, and it's going to lead to a lot of change. The history of innovation and change is it always in time generates more wealth and leads to more jobs. But at the time, people in threatened sectors get very frightened about it. And so there's often a political push. That's maybe where the politicians are on this. Some of the comments of Sunak I found slightly extraordinary. That this might lead to superior chemical weapons we don't understand and all the rest of it. I mean, I think there's a certain amount of hyperbole here.
I was completely blown away by Sunak's approach. I mean, it was so heavy-handed. I mean, I haven't seen. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he did say something promising about it. Like, here in the States, in DC, I've been to several AI events in the last few weeks. It's very yin and yang, promise and peril, challenges, opportunity. I mean, it's the whole gamut. For every dystopian chemical attack, there's obviously cancer research that's being talked about, deposits and all that. I was quite surprised that Sunak was so down on it. I don't know if this is like a campaign ploy or some kind of like scare Middle England or like where the Tories can figure this out. But clearly, I mean, data, as you point out, I mean, collecting it, using it better, that's got to be positive.
Also, isn't this a slightly extraordinary concept that we're going to have global regulation on something? We haven't got about the only thing we have global regulation on is the mail system. So
maybe in rugby and maybe cricket and rugby.
Well, yeah, that's serious ends of things. But if you think about it, I think it's only the International Postal Union. It's the only organization that every country belongs to. So should you wish to send a letter to some of your friends in Pyongyang, that's no problem. They may get opened by the authorities the other end. But, it gets there.
Wait, is that an actual organization, the International Postal Union?
Yeah, the International Postal Union was set up in the 1850s or 1860s or something, isn't it? You have to look it up. You're going to fact check me now. You're going to get BBC verified. But there's
Ructions verified.
Yeah, Ructions verified. But the point is, if I really had one of these sort of evil genius James Bond type AI algorithms, how on earth am I going to get regulated? Who's going to regulate?
Yeah, and then exactly, like, who's the cops? And then it's interesting because our friend Liz Truss, the Chinese have been invited to the summit next week in the UK, and I guess she's quite displeased because obviously, you can't have Chinese be a part of any kind of international solution to any kind of problem. I think what's interesting too, getting back to the culture, this quote I'm going to butcher, but essentially, it's because to me, like the summit, I was like, Sunak, this is great. UK can really, plant the flag, really can like say, hey, we're like going to lead the way on AI. I thought it was like really powerful. Obviously, academic institutions in the UK, this place in the world, like this seemed all smart. And then the speech was so heavy-handed, I didn't really get it. Kind of missed the plot to me. Like I didn't get.
It's all part of my latest mantra, which is the post-imperial delusions of the West. The idea that we're going to rock up and tell the rest of the world, here's a set of rules and you better obey them. Okay, so I break the rules. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to send an aircraft carrier, or what are you going to do? I mean, I just don't.
Well, let's go. But this is interesting because I'm butchering this quote because obviously, the French are desperate. They're also trying to find some kind of tech Silicon Valley approach to the new world. And I think about Japan as well, like their use of robotics. Basically, there's a cultural dynamic here too. Like Hollywood, right, is like so influenced, like thinking, like getting back to Hal and what's the great movie? Stanley Kubrick. I'm blanking.
You're thinking of 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah, exactly. Like this kind of like pop culture is like infiltrated policy, which you can't divorce yourself from, obviously. That's also an interesting thing. Like, I mean, Hollywood is obviously going to sell shock and awe. They're not going to sell, hey, AI is great. It just, it solved your grandmother's cancer. We're going the other direction.
And I think it's going to be around. It's going to lead to a lot of homogenized rubbish. So, you're going to have in your world a huge amount of press releases will be written by algorithms, and they'll be so bland they'll be even more unreadable than they are currently. And again, where's the creativity? Where's the newness? To me, there's no newness in this. So I can get a piece of software and I can write a blog and it can be converted into Shakespearean sonnets, which is both clever and stupid. But it doesn't create a new form of writing. Or in painting, okay, you can paint something so it looks like it's by David Hockney. but it doesn't create a new David Hockney persona with a new branch of art, as far as I can see. I see no creation in this.
Also, this is good too. I read this quote, essentially, the amount of carbon and just electricity that is needed by AI to execute. Somebody was saying, to your point, like if you had an email and you're like, make this, in the sound of William Shakespeare, and you sent that to Chat GPT, that is the equivalent of having a pizza delivered by a Lamborghini. I mean, it's like the amount of energy used to run this AI. Nobody's even talking about that.
Well, we're skeptical, and I think, so we don't run this show into 3 hours. I mean, there are millions of examples of this. I guess we watch how it goes, but I think Mr. Sunak's photo opportunity at the code breaking place in Bletchley will soon be forgotten.
So next week, UK, US, big AI regulation, no deal, big deal, little deal.
I'm struggling to stay interested as far as next week.
There we have it. I think here's my thing about this. I think in the short term, probably not a big deal, but long term, the future of the web, much more regulated, much more data localization. We're not having an international postal union. Much more local governments taking control. I think that's going to be the future of the internet. Much more regulation.
Well, I think there'll be a lot of control, but I would predict it'll be bureaucrats sitting on committees saying how important it is they have more regulation.
That sounds good. I love bureaucrats having croissants and sorting out the world. All right, that's all we got. Well, no, we're going to do reading and watching. Gerald, what are you reading and watching?
I've gone back to using a bit of old technology. I still have a CD player.
Wow, amazing.
Yes, one of the dinosaurs. Well, I still have a VHS player, but I don't think.
Good Lord.
I don't think
that's amazing.
I can plug it into anything, but I can. I still have my CD player, and I realized many years ago, more than 10 years ago, I bought the box set of Band of Brothers, and I hadn't watched it since I first bought it, so I've been watching that. HBO series. I'm going to stretch the year now. I want to say 2003, 2004, sometime around then. Spielberg, and a big behind the scenes player in this was Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks was a co-producer, and I think he's directed a couple of the episodes. And I think it holds up very well. I mean, I think a lot of Hollywood movies on warfare were pretty dire, to be honest, or a little bit sort of cowboy and Indians, for want of a better phrase. And I suppose Spielberg, to his credit, changed a lot of that with the Private Ryan film. And then there was the follow-up, which is Band of Brothers, and then there's a follow-up to that which I've never watched, which was a similar genre but in the Pacific. But I don't think it ever got quite the same coverage as the Western one. The great thing about Band of Brothers is it is based very closely on a particular group of people in the 101st US Airborne, and it's pretty accurate. And rather touchingly and quite poignantly, they got some cut-in interviews with the actual people, obviously well into their, I guess, 80s when they were interviewed. And I would think probably most of them are no longer with us. So it's very well done, and I think still sets a benchmark for that type of stuff.
Well, I've heard it's exceptional. I've actually myself never seen it, which is pretty wild. But yeah, everybody I know who's been affiliated with it or seen it, high praise.
Yeah, you really
raves about
I think you'd enjoy it. So that's what I've been watching. Reading, I can't keep away from history books, but here's one. This is it's called Russian Roulette. It's by an author I've plugged on here before called Giles Milton.
Oh yeah.
Last time Giles Milton was a story about how the Dutch sold Manhattan to the English, which was quite amusing from an English point of view. And this one is Russian Roulette, the deadly game, how British spies thwarted Lenin's global plot. And it's that rather remarkable set of affairs when Lenin was spirited out of Finland and out of the West and then via Finland back into Russia, and nobody stopped him until he got there. And then there was a frantic scramble to try and shut down was a much bigger thing than just taking over Russia. And so it's got a slight James Bond knockabout feel to it. Giles Milton's a very good, entertaining writer, but he's a historian, and it's factual and correct. You may want to check that with BBC Verify, but I'm sure it's fine. And it's a very good book. So there we go, Russian Roulette by Giles Milton.
Love Russia, man. I need to spend more time thinking about Russia. So that sounds good. Was that an actual term, Russian roulette, or is that just, do you know the origin of Russian roulette? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I just think as a publisher thought it's a headline grabbing title.
No, but is that an actual phrase? Does that actually mean anything? Or I mean,
well, yeah,
besides the game itself.
You know where it comes from, where you put one round into a barrel of a pistol and you spin.
But is that an actual activity in Russia? I mean, is that how did you just become like this?
I have evidence about whether it is or not. I've never been invited to those sort of parties, I must admit.
Oh, you've survived every Russian roulette party you've been to, I guess.
Well, that's one of those binary questions which you know the answer to, because if you hadn't, I wouldn't be here to answer it.
Well, I've got two books for you. This is a business book. My buddy Scott Edinger just dropped this book, The Growth Leader. Really, Scott's foremost at sales, really working with the C-suite. He's really good at sorting out the strategy to set your sales. And his idea essentially is that, the leadership really sets the direction of sales. It's not the salespeople, it's really the leadership. So really good book on the insights, alignment, strategy, good stuff. Just dropped this week on Tuesday. Excited for Scott, so check that out. Certainly my business could benefit from more sales, so I'm going to be reading that this weekend. And then I went to this reception the other night. Matt Harnack, he writes he has a project called William Brown Project. This is his latest cookbook. He has a whole series. Matt's really interesting, great photographer, very creative guy. He's got a great blog, great newsletter, great Instagram.
And so
Matt's
is this an attempt to sort of uprate the old-fashioned sort of cookery menu style, celebrity chef type book? Or?
Yeah, exactly. Like Matt's like a totally normal guy, like upstate New York. Obviously lives in Manhattan now and has a place actually in France. A very interesting, colorful guy, but very creative. But yeah, very straightforward recipes, very kind of classic all-American stuff that doesn't require, French culinary training or having copper pots and pans thrown at you, and it's just kind of straightforward dishes that everybody kind of likes. So he did a book event this week at Shea Bailey Suit in Georgetown. Was able to go to that. He'll actually be on Jimmy Fallon's show tonight. But
so
good stuff.
Is your family looking forward to an upgrading of culinary feats in the Ross household now? I'm
actually I'm not too bad. Last night I made steak salads and grilled up some steaks and chopped up a fresh salad. So that's good. My wife, obviously, if it was up to me, I would just eat, meat and potatoes every night. So it's good to have somebody who's getting some kale into my diet every now and then. So no, I like to cook. I'm not a great baker. I've tried to get into bread baking. As you know, baking, much more science, much more chemistry, much more precision required. Cooking, you can just throw it in, chuck stuff in, and always add seasoning. So I prefer to be a cook as opposed to a baker.
I agree entirely. And it keeps you off the carbs as well. So there you go.
But there's nothing like fresh baked bread. And I don't know, pizza is really fun to make, but bread, I just find baking really, I don't know, I don't have the mental focus to be a good baker.
It's quite finessed, isn't it? It's easy to get it wrong very quickly.
Very easy. Whereas cooking, not really that hard to get it wrong. Especially if my favorite dish to make is chili, which is, just throw 20 things in a pot and let it sit for 5 hours. Pretty hard to mess that up.
This sounds like your equivalent of my curry, basically. I can curry anything.
Yeah, maybe I should make a curry this weekend. I don't even know, I guess a curry, you just got to let it sit for a bit, right? And just make the sauce. Is that the key?
Yeah, you make a sauce and then
thicken
you can pretty much put anything in it that's kind of close to its use by, or definitely past its use by date. So
How do you thicken it? Do you use yogurt and stuff, or does it need to be
no,
thick?
I don't actually. Mine is probably a little too thin, but I just chuck all sorts of rubbish in and then make a curry sauce with it.
Love it. AI will never be able to match your cooking. That's what I'm hearing.
Well, at least I am confident that I am more likely to invent a new curry than AI is. Now, that's a big claim, actually, because AI should be able to go. In fact, I'm probably wrong, aren't I? Because AI should be able to go and look at all the infinite combinations of ingredients and come up with new things. But maybe if I create something, a new product, which is not a curry, then I'll be ahead again.
Well, no, you're spot on about the rub about AI. It's just a matter of it's just using past data to match probabilities. Like this is probably what the output. So if you introduced a new element, how would it know what to do?
So the key in life, and to get ahead of all of this stuff, is to create new data.
There we go. New data. All right, everybody. That's all we got for this week. Thanks. Busy week. Excited for Bletchley Park. Will you be outside the gates of Bletchley Park, or?
No. I can think of many other things to do.
So Gerald will not be outside the gates. So.
No, I can confirm that now.
All right, everybody. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Ciao.
Take care. Bye-bye.